Now see it, person to person, a weekly document for television, as told by the faces and voices of people in the news.
Let's go, Buster.
What did you say your name was again?
I didn't.
No, I guess you didn't at that, did you?
Start pushing people around, taking over the town, and we had to...
Had to what?
Well, we had to take them into custody, that's what. You know? I clapped the old bracelets on them myself. Hey, you won't be wanting that slab of pie.
Marshal. What do you think you're doing?
Let go of me! You've
Not
got
now.
to stop this! Let go of me!
Well, it's what people know about themselves inside that makes them afraid.
Hello, Louis.
Birds.
We hid a murder behind them.
You never understand, woman. That wasn't anything we wanted to do. When Duncan found out the mine was on government property, it was just a technicality, really. But he was determined to turn us in. Wouldn't listen to reason.
Is that why? Is that really why it happened?
Don't you see, Sarah? They would have closed down the mine. Do you know what would have happened to this town then? Would have been the end of everything that we've worked on. All of it. All of us. And you too, wife. Now, sometimes we have to do what's necessary to do for the good of everybody. That's the price of progress.
And what's the price of a human life, Louis? Ask your good friends if they know that.
I'll say it's sure taken a hell of a while to bother you.
And especially the church. All right. I'll paint if you say we got to.
It's no secret that tabloids skewer celebrities on a weekly basis. But how do they get away with it? What prevents the rich and famous from suing? Well, legally, it mostly has to do with just how famous you are and who is willing to spill the dirt.
in a few weeks when I'm free. See how battered Nicole hid her bruises at family party for OJ. And catch OJ two-timing Nicole with sexy TV hostess. Reach for a Star. Princess Di frantic as thieves steal her intimate sex files from Shrink's office. Plus, friends say Lisa Marie Presley is pregnant by Michael Jackson. Star takes you inside their explosive marriage. Reach for a Star.
We'll follow the story as it continues to ramble through the news pages.
Ramble.
Canute Berger,
Really very.
I said earlier that nobody watched the show last week, and the reason was that during this broadcast on Friday night, O.J. Simpson was wandering around the freeways of Los Angeles, followed by a lot of helicopters. I kept expecting two of them to collide at some point, two or more. You wrote about this phenomenon, which this media spectacle, which has, I think, prompted all sorts of complicated reactions for all of us. You wrote that people don't matter, celebrity matters. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, it's amazing to me. These kinds of stories come along and you realize how helpless we all are in face of them. There's a compellingness to them because of the fame of the people involved. I mean, you know, you look at the thing last Friday with O.J. Simpson's. I was thinking about the most famous ride since Paul Revere, except instead of, you know, the British are coming, it's My Psychic Pain on parade. And I watched it. So did 95 million other Americans. It was absolutely fascinating. I watched it. So did 95 million other Americans. It was absolutely fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. I watched it. So did 95 million other Americans. It was absolutely fascinating. It skews everything. We forget the victims. You saw the people waving the signs. As I said in that piece, you know, people don't wave signs for the victims. They wave signs. They think they know O.J. There's the shock of how could someone we knew so well do this? Of how could someone we knew so well do this? Of how could someone we knew so well do this? It becomes just a fascinating thing, and just a fascinating thing, and the myth of how could someone we knew so well do this? It becomes just a fascinating thing, and the media is you know, the conduit, but it's also reflective. The intense view, I think, is the reflection of the intense interest people have.
Seeing the crowds holding up signs, yelling, "Go, O.J., go!"
If you have money in the courts, you have the opportunity to to tell your story in the media and convey and influence public opinion. You see that going on now with the way the prosecutors and defense and people are leaking information. And on the other side, you have science, and you have the fact that, you know, science has a difficult time proving anything. And if you have enough, I think I think there's a way in which, you know, it becomes a spectator sport after the fact. And of course, these things always remind you that, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches and DNA tests. I think there's a way in which, you know, it becomes a spectator sport after the fact. And of course, these things always remind you that, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. Always remind you that, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And remind you that, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches. And I think there's a way in which, you know, it becomes a spectator sport after the fact. And of course, these things always remind you that, you know, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches and DNA tests.
News media have some things to answer for in all this. Lots of inaccurate reporting in the hours and days.
gives a...
It's no secret that tabloids skewer celebrities on a weekly basis. But how do they get away with it? What prevents the rich and famous from suing? Well, legally, it mostly has to do with just how famous you are and who is willing to spill the dirt.
You in a few weeks when I'm free. See how battered Nicole hid her bruises at family party for OJ. And catch OJ two-timing Nicole with sexy TV hostess. Reach for a star. Princess Star.
They're like, what's the big deal?
I don't really give a shit what they think.
No. I mean, it's like, I'm sure my parents, like when John F. Kennedy died and shit, they made a big deal over that, and I can't really understand that, but that was their thing.
I would have rather had the president killed than have Kurt Cobain shoot himself in the head.
I hate the president right now. I have no respect for Bill Clinton at all.
I don't have respect for any of the presidents.
Well, you see, now that's the kind of thing that older folks are going to find hard to understand. They're going to say, well, you know, maybe Bill Clinton smoked a little bit of pot or whatever, but by golly, he worked hard and he became the president of the United States with some help from his wife and all that.
Who cares? It's still a dick.
News now, an autopsy has failed to determine what caused the death of a Seattle rock musician. Kristen Pfaff belonged to the punk rock band Hole. The band is headed by Courtney Love, widow of grunge star Kurt Cobain. He committed suicide in April. Como's Enrique Cerna reports toxicology tests will be conducted to see if Pfaff died from a drug overdose.
Kristen Pfaff was last seen alive on Wednesday night. She'd been with two friends at her Capitol Hill apartment. About 9:30, she left them to take a bath. The next morning, a friend found Pfaff in the tub, dead. Police say syringes and other drug paraphernalia were found nearby. The 27-year-old Pfaff joined the band Hole last year. The group's record company says she had a history of heroin abuse, and this past winter entered a drug rehabilitation program. In a telephone interview from his Denver home, Pfaff's father says he believes she had overcome any past drug problems.
And if she was on Wednesday night, that, you know, that's a tragedy. And but I don't have any reason to believe it was anything that was regular or something that she wanted as part of her lifestyle.
Surviving members of Hole issued a statement this afternoon saying, "We are obviously shaken by the recent tragedies affecting our band, but have decided to continue on as a band after we regroup, collect our thoughts, and mourn the passing of a very loved person." If toxicology tests confirm Pfaff's death as drug-related, she will become the third major Seattle rock musician to die from an overdose in the last 4 years. Others include Stephanie Sargent of the group 7 Year Bitch and Andrew Wood of the band Mother Love Bone.
In the Kristen Pfaff case, toxicology results will be known in 4 to 6 weeks. Pfaff's body will be flown to Buffalo, New York, where she'll be buried.
About a month before the coroner's office knows exactly what caused the death of grunge band member Kristen Pfaff. The 27-year-old bass player for the group Hole was found dead inside her Capitol Hill apartment in Seattle yesterday morning. Police reports indicate drug paraphernalia was found near her body, but an autopsy today did not conclude if Pfaff died from a drug overdose. Toxicology tests are underway.
Stories making news in the Northwest tonight. King County medical examiners say Seattle musician Kristen Pfaff did not intend to kill herself. They say her drug overdose last month was accidental. Pfaff played for the alternative band Hole, a band headed by Courtney Love, the widow of Nirvana's Kurt Cobain. She was found dead in the bathtub of her Capitol Hill apartment 1 month ago.
Oh, say, Mr. Stamper.
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, fine. How are you?
Pretty good.
Good.
You're tremendously difficult to get a hold of on the phone these days. So.
Well, I don't doubt that. I know that I am.
Well, sir, what I wanted to ask is that I've been looking into the Kurt Cobain death for the last 3 months.
Are you the one I talked to?
I spoke to you very briefly at one point, yeah. And the evidence suggests that Kurt Cobain died at a bloodless or near bloodless crime scene. And I'm wondering just what you might intend to do about that.
I'm not here for that purpose today.
Well, sir, just when might you be available for that purpose?
Check with my aide and he can talk.
Are you aware that the King County Medical Examiner now says that Mr. Cobain died without an exit wound? You're not aware of that?
I'm not here for that purpose.
Well, sir, you are the chief of police, are you not?
That's right, and I'm here at a community function whose purpose is to show me the Denny regrade. Excuse me.
But, sir, you're never available to address this purpose.
I'm not here for
and the
that
fact
purpose.
is that these are two unsolved homicides that
That's
I'm
okay.
discussing that you refuse to address. When do you think you might be available to do that?
What did you need to know, Valerie?
Sir, we're going to do a presentation.
If Kurt Cobain died of a gunshot wound that is completely physically impossible, don't you think that that's an
I'm
issue
sorry,
that you
but you're
should address?
interrupting her, okay?
Okay, listen, let me explain to you what's going on here, okay? Now is not the time to talk to him, okay?
Well, is there a time later today when I can talk to him?
Not today, okay? We're doing a walkabout with this community, and they're trying to point out their problems right now, okay?
Officials say
Hello, I'm Richard Lee. The media, it sounds like a convention of spiritualists. Junk journalism is the evidence of a society that has got at least one thing right, that there should be nobody with the power to dictate where responsible journalism begins. These highly quotable words from Tom Stoppard's 1978 play about journalism and ethics, Night and Day, are a good starting point for a discussion of a prevailing trend in infotainment news that is in considerable need of a good thrashing. The phenomena of celebrity, especially televisual celebrity, is largely based on a set of intuitive presumptions in the mind of the public that we can take a good close look at someone, know a few choice facts about them, and make up our minds as to what extent we feel that they are really okay folks, or to what point we feel that they are or are not our kind of people. This celebrity as psychological specimen undoubtedly has had a great many societal benefits as a byproduct. After all, who could, in the 1960s, after having seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, who could have, after seeing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, have had any considerable objections to having Sidney Poitier over to your house? Madonna may not be your cup of tea, but when doing her close-up and personal publicity thing, the Material One shows that there is something cuddly and human in the hearts of the promiscuous and rebellious young. O.J. and Michael Jackson certainly fall into a category all their own, but at least serve to inform the greater public, from little old ladies who read the tabloids to young children who see the tabloid stories on the evening TV, that there certainly are personality types that one might want to keep an eye out for purposes of self-preservation at least. That is, of course, this presentation involves some assumption of guilt on the part of Mr. Simpson or Mr. Jackson. But certainly they at least represent personality types in their personas on our TV screens and in the newspapers. The most disturbing trend in this national fixation on celebrity as far as its effect on mainstream journalism is that journalists too readily accept the role of observer and interpreter, asserting that they are making objective observations when in fact they allow their observations to become imbued with the sort of presumptiveness that would seem to make them unidentified members of the Psychic Friends network. With O.J. trucking down the freeway in mid-June with reportedly a pistol at his head, at least one hovering reporter was cited by media critics for giving play-by-play as to what, according to his interpretation, was going through O.J.'s head at that moment, wondering whether or not to blow it off. The death of Kurt Cobain has certainly been an even more obvious example of this trend. Within hours of the discovery of the body, the psychobabble interpretation avalanche began, with ABC's Diane Sawyer, for instance, calling Kurt Cobain another casualty of success on the evening news that evening, with, of course, this highly interpretive approach duplicated everywhere, immediately and forever, so it would seem, obliterating any serious examination of the very mysterious circumstances surrounding this baffling case. The whole program, the whole point of this program's investigation, of course, is to try to kick the crystal balls out from under anyone in the local or national media who wants to use the Cobain death as their basis for attacking Mr. Cobain's largely very admirable life, the generation for whom, to some measure, he was a spokesperson, or even the public's sensibilities toward good taste and fair play, particularly for people who aren't around to defend themselves at this point. In the film clips you have seen tonight, you will have noticed that I made some effort to make a side-by-side presentation of the national tabloid The Star and our town's own weekly thing, Seattle Weekly. I certainly would not want anyone to draw too many conclusions from this type of obvious comparison. These are different papers that serve different audiences for different purposes. And I would very much like to emphasize that the last thing that I would ever want to do is to deliver some sort of broadside slam to the reputation of a publication which has done some very interesting reporting on certain issues, and which undoubtedly serves very well the interests of its readers, despite sometimes not meeting my personal tastes or standards. After all, The Star provides a huge audience with reading material that they enjoy, and even manages to break some very important national news that very much serves the public's interest very greatly. After all, it wasn't journalism's big-time iconoclasts of 60 Minutes who broke the Jennifer Flowers story. It was The Star. 60 Minutes merely followed up on The Star's trailblazing for their big Bill and Hillary Allow Us to Feel Their Pain interview, during which, by the way, the 60 Minutes crew damn near killed the president and first lady-to-be when a lighting fixture nearly fell on top of them. The big 60 Minutes contribution to the last presidential race was to run that awful Ross Perot says he pulled out of the election because of his daughter's wedding farce, a story so silly one wonders if The Star might have turned it down if it were offered, or if, in fact, they might have turned it down, in fact, from the rather questionable sources that 60 Minutes used to report the Jennifer Flowers story. And who knows, had the majority of the rest of the major media had a fraction of the gumption shown by Ms. Flowers and The Star, we might have wound up with a capable technocrat type, like, for instance, Al Gore as chief executive, working on healthcare reform and all the rest of it, which might not have been such a bad thing after all, right? And I actually went to the degree of purchasing a star today. And if you look at the star, it's not really quite so bad as you might be led to believe. We've got the OJ kids on the cover here, and they're treated very well. It's almost a sort of heart-wrenching story about you know, the heartbreak of a broken family, as I'm sure that's how their readers will understand it. Certainly there aren't many families broken in quite the way the Simpson family has been, but that's the way they relate this material to their readership. We've got NYPD Boo, a story about David Caruso, the actor, leaving the TV program. I saw this story reported on a local TV news program today, just like the Star. They cover much of the same material, and I would say on the whole, looking at the Star, which I don't often do, it doesn't look too objectionable at all. In fact, the only thing I could find at all to object to would be this on the back cover, which is a cigarette ad. But as far as the editorial content of the Star, it wasn't too bad at all. Not really my thing, in as much as it's all about celebrities, but certainly not necessarily the object of the fair object of all the derision that it receives. Other than the cigarette ad, which is something of probably a necessity for the Star. After all, many of their readers probably are smokers. Just looking at any demographic, I'm sure that must be at least partially true. One can almost imagine the Dan Quayle family relaxing at home with the Star, and of course, given Mr. Quayle's well-known deficiency in his writing skills, the Star, with its bright color photos and remedial vocabulary, would seem to be just the ticket for boosting those lagging literacy levels on Mr. Quayle's part. The Star, as far as I can see here, passes muster. In fact, one might call it a Grey Poupon of celebromania printed matter. And the same, to get to the substance of this evening's program, the same about passing muster can unfortunately not be said of this item here. Hold it as such. And, well, I've managed to find a resource of humor to relate my reaction to this cover story on Kristen Pfaff with, although don't let the humor I've worked up here get in the way of understanding my considerable outrage about this. The same, I am afraid, cannot be said of the Seattle Weekly as far as passing muster. Our very own street corner hustler of too often bad news. That is, badly reported news and warped views. As I once even had an article printed in its pages, I've tried to harbor a reservation that I ought not to try too hard to tell tales out of school on these boys. After all, I don't want to get a reputation for biting the hand that feeds me, even though understand that according to the pay that the Seattle Weekly gives to those who write for them, which is more or less merely reimbursement for expenses, according to my experiences, I can certainly say that I have not had the experience of being fed anything by Seattle Weekly other than what the rest of the public is fed whenever they plunk down 75 cents for its movie listings, classifieds, or whatever. The whatever in this case actually encompasses articles of an acceptable quality, I'll admit, and my qualms are certainly not with those writers who have published work of an acceptable quality here. The standard by which this paper must be judged, though, or honestly, I feel, any journalistic entity, is really how bad it is at its worst, as, in fact, it so often is at its worst. That is the Seattle Weekly. And at its worst, I would say with considerable confidence that the SW is so bad that I, for one, often feel my gorge rising as I read its transgressions, with the very most deficient examples of its journalism such that it is a wonder that I don't actually blow chunks of gorge all over this absorbent item. This, in fact, might be a suitable use for many volumes of this publication, as I most certainly would discourage anyone from wrapping fish with it, offending one's bird with this as cage lining, or even, it occurs to me, wiping my arse with it, in the absence of a tissue for fear that I might catch some horrible disease. So you can see that I am not a happy camper as far as the SW paper goes. And I should point out, although this does clearly go outside my preference to not discuss private negotiations publicly, that I had considerable dealings with SW in trying to make the public aware of the great weight of evidence indicating murder in the case of Kurt Cobain. From the very start of this investigation, I offered SW an opportunity to accept a story from me on this repeatedly, basically for the very low compensation that the SW offers, and then finally had the chief editor, Berger, Mr. Berger, accept this offer in a very limited way in the days immediately following Kristen Pfaff's death. Their assertion was, that is to say, Mr. Berger's assertion was, in TV cop lingo, that I was, quote-unquote, too close to the story, and that I ought to convey my findings, that is, 2 months' worth of work, to one of their more regular writers, one who, even by their description, was close in working with the local police, whom, as you know if you followed this TV series at all, fit more into the description of participants, accessories after the fact, to the murder of Kurt Cobain, so the evidence indicates, than law enforcement investigators in earnest. So I had my problems with this arrangement at the outset, but I was concerned about getting the word out on this in some reasonable frame of time. This is again mid-June. And so I sat down with this SW reporter for 2 hours and gave him the whole story as to the evidence indicating that Kurt Cobain was murdered and that this was actively covered up, which, as the interview progressed, I felt more and more regretful about, as it became clear that this allegedly on-the-ball reporter was not, had not, the faintest grasp of any of the details concerning the Cobain case as it was reported in the press. I am not overstating the case to say that he seemed not to ever have read a single article or even seen a single TV spot on Cobain's death or even his life. In fact, during our initial phone conversation, this allegedly on-the-ball reporter referred to Mr. Cobain twice as Keith Cobain. So again, I had my doubts from the outset, but was willing to go along with this. Yet I promised, as I'm explaining, and yet I had promised the chief editor that I would cooperate, and I tried to do this, emphatically lecturing this apparently vision-impaired reporter on the key facts, and even saying that I would hand over an 83-page bound volume of documents that I have accumulated on these matters, which this reporter clutched possessively throughout the interview. Everything went pretty badly, in fact, in the session, but I was still willing to cooperate, fool that I am. in honoring my initial agreement, up to the concluding moments of our interview, during which, by the way, he did not take notes, or very, very few notes. And when this reporter informed me at that point, without even examining the evidence, that he would write his story to include an outright dismissal of my primary investigative finding, that is, that I discovered video that shows the top of Mr. Cobain's body, that is to say, the top of the head of Mr. Cobain's body at the crime scene, without a drop of blood to be seen, and that further, the King County Medical Examiner the next day, after I first aired this video, then changed the wound description to no exit wound, contradicting their earlier description and essentially constituting a quite impossible wound scenario. Well, that sentence certainly was a mouthpiece, but what I'm saying is that at the conclusion of the interview, that reporter indicated that he would reject my primary finding, which is that Mr. Cobain did not suffer a realistic head wound, that I aired the video proving this, and that the next day the medical examiner changed his description to no exit wound, which is an impossible wound scenario. That is the principal finding of this investigation, indicating that Kurt Cobain did not die of a shotgun wound. And that reporter told me that he would reject this out of hand without even examining the evidence, that it was obviously just a typographical error or something along those lines, so he said. And so at that point I grabbed my bound volume of notes and documents and got out of there, only to be told by the editor at SW that they now deemed me to be unreliable based on the unsavory details of this interview and the fact that I would not cooperate with what I felt to be was going to be a whitewash of my investigation by a reporter who had not done a minute's work on it prior to my arrival in the interview with him. And so, because of this experience, they were deeming me unreliable, indicating that they would not work with me at any time in the future, and even more severely, that they were now rejecting a manuscript that I labored over for 8 months for them on their instructions. This was concerning the skinhead gang that was apparently stealing arms from the U.S. Army. This is a story that surfaced last July and that I worked on for doggone near a year, about 11 months, and much of this work was full-time on the story. Months and months of full-time work. They decided that they would never publish this on the basis of my quote-unquote unreliability, based on not going along with a whitewash of the findings in my investigation on Mr. Cobain's death. So there I've done it. I've told my tale out of school. I actually had quite a lot of reservations about ever doing this. Just because it's not considered quite acceptable or respectable, but certainly it now is an important part of this story, particularly given that the writer that they did find to do a story on Kristen Pfaff apparently did very little original work on this story. In fact, the good parts in it all come from other sources. A couple of papers in Minnesota that had interviews and information on Kristen Pfaff that were quoted extensively in the story actually provide some interesting information. But do read between the lines if you endeavor to purchase this paper, and you will see a continual tendency to closely associate Kristen Pfaff with heroin use, with which she was not closely associated, and all sorts of other Psychic Friends network interpretation of some very scant facts about how Kristen Pfaff died, indicating that this writer, with the weight of Seattle Weekly behind him, firmly believes that Kristen Pfaff was just another pathetic case in a long line of pathetic cases of pathetic part-time druggies who caused their own death here in the Seattle music scene. So what I plan for next week, unless something more dramatic comes up, is something of a line-by-line examination of this story, in which I will argue, I'm sure persuasively, that very little work was done in an original way on this story, that it's mostly other sources that are borrowed from not quite so unusual for the Seattle Weekly, in fact, and that this story does constitute a really very sad case of whitewashing of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death, the homicide of Kristen Pfaff, and the murder, that is homicide if not in fact murder of Kristen Pfaff, and the murder of Kurt Cobain. Neither of which, of course, have ever been investigated by the police on that basis. In fact, the police initially called Ms. Pfaff's death a suicide. And then, of course, they had to retract that, and are now saying that she died by, according to causes of accidental overdose. So next week's program ought to be a little more tightly scripted, I think, but you get the idea. Nothing to be happy about at all in this whitewashing of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death, the homicide, the possible murder of Kristen Pfaff, and the murder of Kurt Cobain. So, without sounding too much like Rush Limbaugh, the bodies are piling up on this one, sadly enough. And we'll pursue, Limbaugh-like, in theory anyway, for we'll pursue the truth relentlessly on this one, as Limbaugh's fond of saying, and we'll do so next week, and please join me then.
I think there's a way in which, it becomes a spectator sport after the fact, and of course these things always remind you that, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches and DNA tests. Mm-hmm. I think there's a way in which, it becomes a spectator sport after the fact, and of course these things always remind you that, the victims never get to tell their side of the story, except in blood splotches and DNA tests.
News media have some things to answer for in all this. Lots of inaccurate reporting in